welcome everyone to the talk today by Dr. Jennifer Walker. And this event is co-sponsored by Indigenous Studies and Sociology, and it's funded by the Social Science Student Donation Fund. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Katie Mendes, and I'm going to be kicking us off today with a welcome and a land acknowledgement. I want to begin by welcoming everyone to Western University and acknowledge that it's located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinatown nations. Okay, and today it's not just important that we're mindful and aware that Western's located on these traditional lands, but it's important that we're knowledgeable about the historic and ongoing injustices that Indigenous people have endured in Canada, and how centuries of colonialism and racism has and continues to impact their lives and their health. And this is something that our speaker today has particular expertise in. So I think it's really important that we welcome Dr. Walker today, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to reflect on our responsibility as staff and students, to reveal and correct miseducation and the lack of education around Indigenous communities and their ways of knowing. And I want us all to think about the role that we can play in creating or renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities, and how we can do this through our teaching, our research, and our community service. So I want to now pass you off to Dr. Chantal Richmond, who's the Acting Director of Indigenous Studies, who's going to formally introduce Dr. Walker.
Okay, good morning. Bonjour. Ani Kiziskwedijnakas Makododam, Digitigon Nishnabek and Dunjaba. My name is Chantal Richmond. Thank you, Katie, for that awesome welcome and land acknowledgement. I love the way you personalized that. So it's really a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Walker. She's Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. She holds a PhD in Community Health Services in Epidemiology from the University of Calgary. She is an associate professor at McMaster University in the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence, and Impact. Dr. Walker's work focuses largely on Indigenous community-engaged health research using large health services databases through her work as a core scientist and Indigenous health lead at the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences, also known as ICES, in Ontario and through the Health Data Research Network Canada. Dr. Walker has an active community-engaged research program in aging and dementia. She is the co-lead of the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, CCNA Team 18 Issues in Dementia Care for Indigenous Populations, and is lead for the Indigenous Cognitive Health Program. She's also led the validation of the Canadian Indigenous Cognitive Assessment Tool and the implementation of the tool in Anishinaabe communities in Northern Ontario. So it's really, it's been my honor and a privilege to work with Dr. Walker on Ontario's Indigenous Mentorship Network. So for the past several years, we've been collaborating and chatting on iPhone and messaging one another because she has, I think, student heart, community participation, Indigenous knowledge at the very center of everything that she does. And I've been, it's been a real honor to witness her passion, her dedication, and the ways in which she engages her students, community partners in prioritizing and making community self-determination the goal of everything that she does. So I just want to say miigwech niawe Jen for your outstanding leadership and especially for your bravery in doing all the work you do. And it's really an honor to welcome you here today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Walker.
Thank you so much for that, Chantal. That's like an emotional way to start, actually. And thank you for this welcome. Thanks for the invitation to be with you and the opportunity to share a little bit with you about what I've learned and maybe what I can share. It's really interesting to prepare for a talk that's co-hosted by Sociology and Indigenous Studies and just thinking about what you might be interested in hearing about and learning about. So I think that yeah, I'm really it's an honor to be here and to have so many of your faces and actually some familiar names on my screen. So yeah, I've recently, for those who have known me, I've recently moved to McMaster University, where I'm also, so I'm in health research methods, evidence and impact, and using, and my research program is sort of reestablishing itself after a bit of a tough time at Laurentian at McMaster. But then also, we're establishing an Indigenous Health Learning Lodge that's just been launched at McMaster University, and a research hub there to better serve community research needs. So yeah, I'm excited about, a big change in my own life, and to be here with you, and to talk to you. So now I feel like I'm just sort of down the road from you, where all of you are. I'm coming to you from Hamilton, and this territory is Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, and we have so I'm actually pretty close now to the community that I'm from, which is that my family is from. I grew up off reserve, actually in the town where I now live, and I'm a member of Six Nations, which is close by. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk for a while and then leave lots of time for us to discuss. And don't hesitate to use the chat. I'll try not to let it distract me, but we can collect up questions and comments or reflections. But also don't hesitate to interrupt me if you really have something burning. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Indigenous data sovereignty and research ethics, just kind of broadly, and give some specifics as well, but really thinking about what is required. As an epidemiologist, I was trained in sort of the use of data for decision making. Probably many fewer people knew what an epidemiologist was before COVID-19. So suddenly, actually, one of the research coordinators I work with has a mug that says "Make epidemiology boring again," which, yeah, would be nice if it was a boring job again, but it actually never has been. But really, like, thinking about it in these sort of various disciplines like epidemiology or health services research that I sort of academically grew up in. How do we really ground that work in Indigenous paradigms and knowledge? I want us to ground ourselves also in a shared understanding of the impact of colonization and how that impacts how we ethically use and approach Indigenous data, and really thinking also about those rights, those inherent rights that are articulated in things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in principles that are informed by these rights around Indigenous data. So I want to start by grounding us in this quote because it says so much, and it says, "The act of knowing is a collective, cultural, and political imperative for Indigenous peoples. Information, data, and research about our peoples, collected about us, with us, or by us, belongs to us and must be cared for by us." And if you think about that really, really closely, there's so much in there. It talks about the responsibility that Indigenous peoples have to care for their own data, that implies that sacredness of data and the importance of data in the holistic view of what is Indigenous data. Indigenous data includes things that are about the lands, about the peoples, about the individuals and the communities, and those, no matter who collected them, if it's about Indigenous peoples, whether it's collected with us or by us, must be cared for by us. So it really reflects that responsibility that Indigenous nations feel for their own data. And I think, if you're someone who works with data or collects data without that in mind, then it takes a lot to kind of think about that responsibility that that Indigenous nations have to data about their people and communities. And if we ground that a little bit, I want to just talk about a few ideas and principles to think about as we're thinking about data, particularly, in this sort of, as we're sort of entering, or we're in the middle of a time when we're really thinking so much about where big data, science, and things like that are going. What ground are we building for ourselves to prepare for personalized medicine, AI, so artificial intelligence, and the kinds of big uses of big data that really need to be informed by principles and grounded in Indigenous knowledges before we even know how to approach these big questions. So it's always worth going sort of back to the basics about what are we doing and why. And it's rare to find Indigenous research methodologies that are applied to quantitative, in a way that's, not just applied, but actually spoken about, articulated Indigenous methodologies for quantitative data. So if you are a quantitative data researcher, then this Indigenous statistics, a quantitative research methodology, helps in framing some of this. And also, many other, it can be informed by many other Indigenous scholars and authors who talk about this sort of approaches that we need to take when we're thinking about Indigenous research and not just data. The ideas of holism, the ideas that in terms of that interconnection between generations, between the earth, the water, the people, the animals, the interconnection between nations, the interconnection within families, the interconnected and holistic nature of health is something I think about a lot as a health researcher. And as we think about how we use how like the framing for the use of data, we also have to think about making sure that the data aren't continuously used in ways that describe disparities, differences, deprivations, but that they are strengths-based, that we're using data as Indigenous people and as Indigenous nations, that we're using our own data to find our next step, on a path to wellness, to healing, to learning, to whatever it is that our goal is. And often our goal is very holistic and interconnected. So rather than this sort of, as an epidemiologist being trained to sort of look for the differences, look for the disparities, and point those out, shed a light on them. That's the point, is making sure that we shed a light on these inequities or disparities. If that's our goal, we're going to end up in the wrong place. If that's our goal, we're going to end up continually telling stories of deprivation and difference. And those stories of deprivation and difference end up being a rationale for discrimination or a rationale for dispossession, because those stories of deprivation and difference convince the broader narrative, or evidence for the broader narrative that Indigenous people can't take care of themselves. And so the importance of the stories and who's telling the story, and what so the voice in that story, no matter if it's actual, stories and narratives, or if it's stories and narratives that are derived from large data sets, that those stories and narratives need to reflect a strengths-based approach. And sometimes, like I say that, and then at the same time, like as someone who is often called on to support Indigenous communities in their use of data, if I impose it, every data analysis has to be strengths-based. There's no place for any looking at disparities and differences. Then sometimes the needs of the community would not be met. Sometimes they need to show they have higher rates of diabetes so that they can justify funding for diabetes. Like, there are reasons sometimes that you would use data in a way to show differences, but the narrative and the story is coming from the community. And the narrative and the story is not about deprivation. The narrative and the story is about healing and meeting the needs of a population and sovereignty in doing that. So really thinking about grounding ourselves in these ideas, and the ideas of collective benefit, that all of our work has to be community-centered and driven and relational. That I as an Indigenous researcher have responsibilities to, in a different way, I believe, than, I see my role as a researcher maybe differently than some of my colleagues see their roles as researchers when they're not working in Indigenous spaces. Maybe they're working in other spaces where they feel this relational accountability, but really this idea that Sean Wilson builds to is relational accountability. This means that I'm not just accountable to myself or my institution or my funders. I'm accountable to my First Nation community, First Nation communities in general, the Métis Nation of Ontario, other communities across Canada, any of the Indigenous nations or organizations that I've partnered with, the Indigenous Diabetes Health Circle. I have responsibilities in relations to the IPHCC, the Indigenous Primary Healthcare Council. Like, wherever I'm working, I feel that those responsibilities to the self-determining and the rights holders, and nations feel that responsibility over data because they are responsible for their populations. And then my role as a researcher is to honor that and to do everything, orient all of the research that I engage in, orienting to supporting the self-determination of those nations. One of the big principles I think we need to be always thinking about is non-interference. And this is interpreted, I've heard stories from many different nations about how this principle of non-interference comes through. It comes through in many of our governance systems across Canada, across Turtle Island, in different ways. There are teachings and principles around non-interference. This is one way that it has been shared and understood, and that is in this wampum that articulates and demonstrates and shows the Two-Road Treaty. And this Two-Road Treaty was made between Haudenosaunee people and settlers. And what this represents is this idea that we can travel alongside each other, that, all of the sort of knowledge systems of the settlers and all of the knowledge systems, governance systems, languages, family structures of Haudenosaunee people can travel alongside each other without interfering with each other. And this agreement that was made was in, the sort of era of making treaties in peace and friendship, not in the era of making treaties for the express purpose of dispossession. But this treaty talks about traveling in friendship and peace forever, as long as the grass is green, as long as the water runs downhill, as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and as long as our Mother Earth will last. And so this is this idea of coming alongside each other, but not interfering with one another's governance systems or structures. And if we approach things with that idea, it really changes our orientation to thinking about working. If you're thinking, you know, I'm a student at Western, or I'm a faculty member at Western, and I'm reaching out, or I'm working with, or I'm a healthcare provider, and I want to talk about programming with First Nation communities or other Indigenous organizations or communities. This idea of not interfering is really, really important. And the idea of coming to something in the spirit of traveling alongside, of learning from each other, but not interfering, is not familiar to us. Like because of a long history of colonization with the express purpose of assimilation. So all of these things that have happened, particularly like some really important vehicles of colonization, like the Indian Act, treaty, like the land appropriation and treaties, and residential schools, that have been in place so that that assimilation happens, and that Indigenous identities, worldviews, languages, families, all those things in that one row of the two rows would fragment and become difficult to sustain. So with that history in mind, you know, understanding that that's we're not very far from all of that in Canada, and we're living that in Canada, and we're living the results of these of this, that we need to really shake up how we think. We need to decolonize. All of us in our responsibilities to reconciliation need to decolonize the way we're thinking about things, so that we don't impose and we don't interfere. And it's going to be a hard thing for many, especially institutions and organizations, to do, because this is very entrenched. This is just some of the things that this was about the Indian Act itself. The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. And this is just showing that the purpose of the Indian Act is this. The great aim is to assimilate. That is, it's clear. There's no disputing it. And this is about residential schools. In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. It was about assimilation. It was about getting people into the sort of into the economic, either out of the way of economic development or participant in economic development. And really, this is the place we're grounded in. Like, we have this shared history in Canada, and we need to think about that when we think about how we move forward in ethical relationships. Those residential schools, I just want to highlight how, you know, you might be able to, like, you can see, especially as the sort of numbered treaties started, if you're familiar with where treaties are, how many residential schools, with that purpose of getting people out of the way of, you know, expanding railroad and just all that economic development. But those intergenerational effects are in place, and this quote from in the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it visited us every day of our childhood through replaying over and over of our parents' childhood trauma and grief, which they never had the opportunity to resolve in their lifetimes. And you know, Chantal mentioned the work that I've been involved in around dementia and aging and cognitive assessments, when we're thinking about the development of those cognitive tools to assess cognition, we have to be really aware that the elders that are gathering with us to inform that development of those tools and the kinds of questions that a clinician should ask and the way that they should be asked has to be trauma informed. Many of those people themselves attended residential schools, or I mean, the group we developed the tool with, almost all had experience with residential schools directly. And then also, you know, in their aunts and uncles and parents and other family members. And I think it has to inform not only, you know, the research part, like not only just a survey or, you know, the way we ask a question. It has to inform the way we actually work with people, the way we bring people together, the kinds of conversations we have, the way we work. And we all have to be really aware of this and be trauma informed in our approaches. Even just the, you know, the first time I talked with one group that I was working with about the idea of using data, using the health services data that have been collected about their communities. You know, I actually spent a good 2 hours them asking questions, me talking about it, talking about how these were data that sit in Toronto that have been collected about all of everybody in Ontario's healthcare encounters. If you've been to the doctor, been to the hospital, all of these things, we've had those data are sitting there. How do you want to use them for your community? What questions do you want to ask of those data? And still people were worried that, like, honestly, after so much time of having this conversation, I thought we were at a common understanding. And then someone just really needed to ask me, are you here to take our hair? Like, are you here to take hair samples? And it was so surprising to me. And I felt just so, it was really emotional actually to think about how much hurt there is with this sort of colonization that people have experienced and the research colonization that people have experienced. And so then it took another long time, right? A lot of conversation about how, you know, about why it was scary to think that I or any of my colleagues might be coming to take people's hair samples and this is around regions where there's mercury poisoning. So, you know, we just have to think about being trauma informed and not perpetuate trauma in the way that we work or the stories we tell with research and data. We all have the shared responsibility, which we talked about, of working towards reconciliation, decolonizing ourselves, and in the ways we do research and work with data. And I'm going to kind of transition now to thinking more about data and the importance of data and Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. And this is a really important, like a lot of the focus around Indigenous governance in the literature, in the sort of movements, is around making sure that there is Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. This top part of this cycle of nation building and data building. A lot of the focus is on principles for Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. If you think of OCAP principles, that is that First Nations should have ownership, control, access, and possession over First Nations data. Those OCAP principles is about Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. We've had some history with this. I think we understand it, but if there's still lots of, you know, you can go to StatsCan and use self-identified Indigenous data with no Indigenous governance. There are lots of places where it's still not in place. There isn't Indigenous governance of Indigenous data where there should be. But at least there's a sort of like lots you can learn about that. Then there's the second part of that cycle, which is the use of Indigenous data for governance. That Indigenous nations need to use Indigenous data for governance. And that's really the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal is that assertion of that initial quote that I put up, which is, we feel a sense of responsibility for this data. It is our responsibility to care for the data and to use the data so that, and not just protect it so that no one else uses it, but so that we can better build our nations, we can better, so it's a cycle. It's a cycle. And so this is where I'm really interested. I'm really interested in working in this space now, because I really want, I think there's enough out there that we can learn and know about putting up the wall and saying, if it's Indigenous data, it needs to be governed by Indigenous nations or organizations. But then what do Indigenous people do in that space? We've made that space now. What do we do in that space? And how do we build our nations using that data? How do we inform our healing using that data? How do we find our next step using that data? Here are some of the examples of those principles that establish that line, those Indigenous governance principles, Indigenous data governance principles. So this, you may have seen, if you haven't, the reference is there, and it's the care principles for Indigenous data governance. And this is like a first attempt at an international level. So it's published by a collective called the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, that I am very lucky to be part of. These are brilliant Indigenous scholars from around the world, who are thinking about Indigenous data from different perspectives. Not all of them are health, so I think they get tired of my health stuff sometimes, but these principles, so if you're familiar with sort of open data principles, a lot of this idea that all research data in general, so this is a mainstream view of open data, all research data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we have this big push internationally in Canada for open data. And as Indigenous scholars working in data spaces, we were kind of like, whoa, except if it's Indigenous data, right? Like, we need to make sure that there's an additional layer. So we're saying, yes, the FAIR principles, which are very well taken up around the world, and people want to be aligning research data to FAIR principles so that it's open and can be reused and used around the world. We also want Indigenous, if it's Indigenous data, that there be another layer, that you're fair and you care. that Indigenous data also needs to be treated in a way where there's collective benefit, there's clear authority of Indigenous nations to control it, there's shared responsibility, and that there's Indigenous ethics. And so you can read about those care principles, but it's something that is applicable. It's sort of, all of these different ways of thinking about it in different nations, in different nation states. And this is just sort of like a way of generalizing it. So it's quite a general set of principles that would then lead you to say, okay, what does this mean in the context that I'm working in? And in the context, for example, of First Nations data, it would lead you to the OCAP principles. It would say, okay, what does authority to control mean in this context? It means that the OCAP principles, First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession of First Nations data have to be in place. And if you haven't had a chance to learn about OCAP principles before, then you're in luck. There's lots of resources for you to learn about OCAP principles. And you don't need to go, and your first step shouldn't be to sort of, email someone and say, hey, can you explain the OCAP principles? Your first step should be go and take the course. There's a course that the First Nations Information Governance Center offers that helps people to understand OCAP a little bit. And you'll still have lots of questions, but then you at least have a base understanding where you can then communicate with the partner you're working with to interpret those OCAP principles and apply them in the work that you're doing. That's what I want to just tell you about a little bit of the process that we went through at ICES. So Chantal mentioned that ICES, and it's that I'm the Indigenous lead as a scientist at ICES. And this is an institute where, and there's an ICES Western, so you may already know about it. But where data from the provincial health system and other kinds of data all sit together in a linkable format, and have been used for over 25 years to inform the health care system and health services from clinical standpoint, from policy standpoint. This been informing our Ontario health system for all those years. Until recently, relatively recently, maybe 10 years though. I gotta stop saying recent. Until fairly recently, there was really no conversation about how those data, one, can be governed by Indigenous nations, and two, be used by Indigenous nations for governance. That cycle, that whole cycle wasn't considered at first until people started using the data in a way that told Indigenous stories. So people started to say, oh, if I look at just these postal codes, those people have addresses on reserve. So I'll do the same report I did, but for First Nations, without any involvement of First Nations. It was actually the Chiefs of Ontario that came to ICES over 10 years ago and said, you got to stop doing that. You got to stop telling our stories without us. We are asserting OCAP, that if your data is about us, we own it, control it, access and possess it. So over years, we developed a way of working together that centers Indigenous data governance principles broadly, but in the context of First Nations, it's OCAP. Those OCAP principles are right in the center of this circle. And we have data governance processes, relationship processes, and with the goal of, ensuring that we're, doing all those things I said, where we're thinking about the data linkage and analytics and, all of that stuff, but within the context of all of those Indigenous perspectives and models of well-being, the holism, but also the relational Indigenous methodologies where possible, and where the partner wants us to be. And then also the evidence with the goal of evidence to build policies and programs to facilitate that second part of the cycle of Indigenous using data for Indigenous to enhance Indigenous governance. So we built this framework. This was like a draft that we threw together on a plane, and it held up, and it stays. It rarely changes, because it's sort of, we built the way of working together, and then we reflected it on paper. So it wasn't sort of like we built it and set out to do it. It sort of like ended up just like showing us what we were doing. But Indigenous data governance systems like this require the right people to be having the right conversation. They have to somehow allow for diverse Indigenous perspectives in governance. We can't say that the Chiefs of Ontario, the data governance agreement that ICES and the Chiefs of Ontario have is, we have to make sure that actually doesn't interfere with the data governance agreement that the Métis Nation and the Chiefs of Ontario have, right? So that principle of non-interference still has to be there. We have to allow for different models of Indigenous governance for different, and even within First Nations, there's lots of different diversity in Ontario of ways. So we have many layers of governance, but it has to really, as an institution at ICES, we had to build something that doesn't interfere with existing Indigenous governance and relationships. It also requires these relationships between people. It's really important to have ethical relationships and ongoing communication, mutual capacity building, all of these things, and strong agreements. Like, two of those things have to go together. You can't really have the relationships standing alone without like agreements we can fall back on and trust. And we can't have the agreements without relationships, because sometimes things go wonky and you need to rely on those, like that trust and the relationships that you've built. So we actually have these data governance agreements with the Métis Nation of Ontario, with Chiefs of Ontario, and as I mentioned, some other First Nations organizations in Ontario, like Grand Coastal Treaty 3 and Kenora Chiefs Advisory. We have different layers of relationships and data governance agreements, but to make sure that there's these are some of the ways we make sure that there's Indigenous governance of Indigenous data. So the Chiefs of Ontario also want to reflect, like, what are our processes that we use to approve the use of the data now that we have governance? Like, what are we doing now that we have this governance? This took a long time to sort through. What I want to highlight here is that there's really two streams. One is like our researchers, like, I want to do a research project. I'm going to get a community partner. We're going to work on something together. That's like one stream. Look how complicated it is. There's another stream for First Nations that are like, we want to know what our rates of traumatic brain injury are. We want to put in a request to know that. We want to work with people at ICS to figure that out. It's a pretty streamlined process. We also have a whole diversity of approaches where, you know, people from individual First Nations or Indigenous organizations are seconded to ICS so that they can access the data directly. Like, we have to find we have to rely on those relationships to be able to find the best ways that work for different communities. I just want to probably end with, because I want to leave time for discussion, but some of the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19 about data, about preparing, I guess, for and the importance of Indigenous data governance. So just for context, one of the things that happened very early in the pandemic is that we started at ICES to put out, we sort of got the COVID-19 testing data at ICS, and we're informing the ministry about how many people were being tested, how many people were testing positive for all of Ontario, and breaking it down by public health unit. Like, so all that work was happening at ICES. And in parallel to and leveraging that, we were able to very quickly get data out to First Nations and to the Métis Nation of Ontario, because we spent all that time building the data governance agreements and all of the processes to support that. So one of my colleagues from Chiefs of Ontario often says that that was a overnight success 10 years in the making, because we worked on that stuff really hard for 10 years, and then we were able to move quickly. So sovereignty is foundational. The data on First Nations do not go to the Ministry of Health. They go to the Chiefs of Ontario, who shares it directly with the 133 First Nations chiefs, and then they put together a report for the ministry. So that is very important, that they are the voice telling this story in this particular example. And then the problem was that where there were not those kind of established relationships and processes, and I'll tell you, that was really for, you know, Indigenous people living in cities, diverse Indigenous people living in cities. We didn't have already strong governance of data, figured out processes to support that. It's taken a long time to get data out to cities, to Indigenous communities, diverse Indigenous communities and cities, because we had not, it wasn't the right time. So people were saying, we need Indigenous identified data, because how we know So different people were all saying that, but no one could agree on how it should be done, how Indigenous people should be identified in the data. There were no self-identifiers already. Should they be self-identifiers? Should there be other identifiers? And it was the beginning of a global pandemic. It wasn't time to have that conversation. So it's worth the time. It's worth the time to invest in these things to make things better. And I just want to, I talk a lot about the data in the way that I'm talking about it because that's my experience and what I know, with the full acknowledgement that not everything that can be counted counts, really. And not everything that counts can be counted. And just really that importance of other approaches, making sure that there's just beyond the surveillance data, that there's story-based methodology. This is a report that I worked on, one of the collaborations with Chantal, and just really how important it is to tell our stories, use data to tell our stories, but it's not defining our stories. I have so many other examples that I didn't get a chance to tell you about, but I will share the slides with you. But I want to make sure we have some time for a discussion. So I'll actually stop there, and then we can talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. That was super interesting. Learned a lot, and that was brilliant. So I already see that there's one hand up. Julian, why don't we go over to you?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm very new to this topic, I'd say, due to the research that I'm doing, just touching on environmental issues that include a lot of Indigenous groups. Now, currently in the west of Canada, where there were pipeline protests because I'm working on pipelines. And when I went into this, I was really, I really liked the idea of non-interference. Just report what is there as true to the perspective as possible. And the problem I ran into is that there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's a couple of astroturfing groups which make it really hard to, especially since the Indigenous people who are involved in these processes are it's a small number of people, right? And you have astroturfing groups, what I think is misinformation, right? But I think in social science, I have this problem that non-interference is very difficult because I have to judge what I include in the data. And if I include in the data instances where, there's confusion spread on purpose, then I'm already not being, I'm already not just reporting what I'm doing, I'm already taking part in the discourse that is going on. So I hope I just explained that in a way that it was somewhat understandable.
Thanks. I mean, I probably need a lot more context to understand it fully, but one of the things I'll just mention, I'll just sort of say is non-interference doesn't mean that you are separate, right? So non-interference doesn't mean that you don't enter relationships with those who should be telling the story. So it doesn't mean that, you're in this observer role, observing something happening and reporting on it. It means that you are actually not interfering with the Indigenous nations' authority to govern, really. And I think that, so in the way that you're talking about this, I think the perspectives, if you're doing things in relation with the nations that you're working with and the voices of the nation, the groups that you're in partnership with are coming through, then I'm not sure the misinformation will get messed up in it. But maybe I'm not quite understanding your positioning in relation to the work. If you're partnering with those who are, it depends on who your partners are, I guess. Yeah. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think it'll give me something to think about over the weekend.
I think I'm going to go to Elizabeth and then Howard. will come to you next.
Hi. So I'm actually from political science, and I think we have like a pretty rough problem with the kind of things that you're talking about. And I've definitely talked to a lot of my colleagues about kind of incorporating Indigenous peoples in their research. And one of the primary things that I'm kind of coming up against in their responses, especially if they're collecting new data, is that they have huge budgetary constraints. And I'm wondering what you would recommend for graduate students or other people who are collecting new data who are struggling with that and are trying to find proxies for the information they're looking at, but maybe don't have the kind of budget to be able to like visit these spaces or to talk to these people individually, or don't have that kind of relationships, because I think for graduate students, that's something that they're coming up against a lot. And I would love to be able to like pass on some of the stuff that I learned here, which was like exceptional in so many ways. And so I'm definitely going to pass it on to my department, but I would be really interested to hear any advice that you had on that.
Oh, wow. What a challenging question that I've not been asked before. So, so congratulations on stumping me. I think that, like, you know, I'm hopeful that graduate students are seeking out Indigenous scholars or those who have experience and relationships already. I don't think the you know, I really hope that budgetary constraints don't then lead people to doing research that could harm people, right? So the really key thing is that you're working in partnership and collaboration, and not doing research about Indigenous people, but doing research with and by, which means that you have to talk to people, right? You can't really, like, engagement at a minimum, even if you can't collect new data.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when I mentioned StatsCan has data that there's no Indigenous governance over, there's no way I would have a graduate student use that data without any Indigenous involvement, right? Because that's unethical.
Exactly, yeah.
So you need to be even compliant with the Tri-Council policy statement on ethical research. You have to at least have Indigenous involvement and engagement if you're going to, even if you're not going to be collecting new data, somehow involving people in the decisions about research questions, decisions about design, and decisions about analysis and interpretation. You need to have that engagement. Is that helpful, Elizabeth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you are absolutely correct. It's just that, you know, unfortunately in political science in general, there is kind of this push towards, you know, being able to come up with a lot of things very quickly. And so it's unfortunate that people don't often do exactly what you say. They write things about Indigenous people as opposed to with them. And it's, and I'm trying to compel them to do the exact sorts of things you're talking about, but it's hard when they're very interested in kind of like thinking about new things, and it's very easy for them to get the StatsCan data, whereas it's not necessarily as easy for them to do the kinds of like deep thinking that they need to be doing about these things. So I was just trying to think of ways I could kind of bring people over to our side. But yeah, that's definitely the right answer. It's just I was trying to think of anything else, but I really
at a minimum, you know, if you're going to use StatsCan data, at a minimum, have an advisory group, right? That represents the you know, it'll never represent, but that can inform from those perspectives.
Yeah,
at a minimum. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your input.
Okay, that's great. I think James, I think is able to unmute himself now, so we'll let him go next. There you are, James.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, especially Dr. Walker, for this presentation. I'm currently at a American Research Institute where unfortunately there just isn't a lot of consideration for this topic, and I'm really trying to push for more of that in a field where at the moment, sad to say, there ain't much of it. My question needs a short anecdote to frame it. I promise not to take up too much airtime. I was at a conference in Saskatchewan a while ago that was a mix of Indigenous community members, practitioners, and researchers. And one of the people I met there was someone who had been down and out and had recently come back to Indigenous community and its spirituality, and it had helped him with a lot of challenges in his life that I won't summarize here. At some point in the course of the day, after I'd finished my PowerPoint slide presentation, he came back to me and he said very enthusiastically that a rock that he had been holding and that he had been praying with had changed color while he was doing so. And my first reaction to this, as someone, just to be clear about my own positionality, as someone who's a secular white science bro, was of course immediately to have a pretty nasty reflexive reaction to that. Oh, well, of course it didn't. And one of the things that made clear to me, especially in conjunction with something that someone else had said to me once, was the thing I struggle with most is, as a white science bro, is ways of knowing that defer in some ways to spirituality. And I would ask my fellow white colleagues and beyond not to think of this as anything that's meant to characterize this person as being in any way ridiculous, quite the opposite. And I think it's very important to combat that impulse because, at least for the people I know, the thing that they often have to struggle with as Indigenous persons moving in white spaces is their spirituality, because they're concerned that it's going to get ridiculed. I struggle a lot with how it is to reconcile my own scientific training with what is a very pronounced Indigenous way of knowing, if you would like to call it that, which is through one's spirituality. It may be, just as say a Christian does, that I just have to bracket all of that and go about my day, but that does feel dishonest. And any guidance, if any exist on this subject, I would be extremely grateful to you too, because I want to be respectful and understanding, but all my training is antagonistic to understanding things from a spirituality point of view, and I don't like that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I can tell that you're already you're sharing that from your heart. So you're already tapping into that, I think. One of the examples I didn't get to share, I think I could probably talk about this for a long time, and I'll try not to, but because there's so many things I could share about teachings that were shared in the context of doing research that sometimes are hard to figure out how they fit and what those experiences are like. And, why did we do a sweat to start this, or why did we do a pipe ceremony? And what happened in that pipe ceremony that influences the research? And these things are really important, though. And sometimes you just have to sort of open yourself to the experience, and then it comes together. If you figure it out, why these things were important and why an elder or someone who crosses your path teaches you in this way. So I just suggest keeping yourself open to those things. I also think, for example, I just want to give this one example of, we were using mortality data. So mortality data of anything, it's sort of really it's just like databases and rows and, and thousands of records. And the community partners who wanted to use this mortality data also wanted to acknowledge that there was a spiritual nature to this whole process of using the data. The spiritual nature of this process is that they're actually, in a way, by accessing this data, listening to their ancestors, because they're all people who have passed on. Every data point is an ancestor. Their collective voices are telling them the ways to live in the future based on how they lived in the past. So this whole spiritual nature of the relationship that the communities had to the data informed the way we approached the data, informed the way we had elders involved, prayers involved, because we were actually asking their family members, their ancestors, how to live in the future. And so I think that you just have to really keep yourself open to listening and to understanding what are people saying and how are we going to look at this work differently, even if we're trained scientists.
Thank you very much. I have to hop off, but just Thank you. So have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. So Sydney, if you can ask it super quick, and Jennifer, we've got like 1 minute left.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Walker. I'm doing research on racialized faculty at a university, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on kind of disaggregating race when you're writing about it. I want to like touch on the Indigenous experience and, you know, different racialized groups' experiences, but my research kind of requires me to assume their race because I'm not directly interviewing them. So I was wondering how you thought maybe I could include an Indigenous perspective in my research, and if it was important to maybe disaggregate when I'm talking about racialized faculty to maybe highlight the differential experiences Indigenous faculty may face.
I think that's an important question about, you know, when you talk about disaggregating, I think that it is an important, the experience may be different. And I think also just because not just the equity kinds of questions might be different, but the rights-based questions might be different. Like there's a whole different framing of Indigenous self-determination and rights that is different than equity seeking, right? Like I think those conversations need to be clear. But I think you should not analyze this is me just telling you what to do, but you should not analyze that without involvement. Like you shouldn't do it by yourself. You need to have guidance on how to do that, how to interpret it, how to share that story. And it should be Indigenous voices involved in doing that. That's my view, Sydney.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry, everyone. I know we would love to keep Jennifer longer, but if everyone can just join me in thanking Jennifer again one more time. It was a really fascinating talk. We really appreciate your time. We know how busy you are. And before everybody goes, if I can just please announce that the next talk for the Sociology seminar series is Dr. Christina Cross, and that will be on the 25th of March. And this event is co-sponsored with CRSI. So her talk is titled Marginal Returns, Race, Family Structure, and Children's Life Chances. So thanks again so much, Jennifer, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.